The first question that we're going to address this evening has to do with the one cup doctrine. How do I answer one cup brethren who say that the cup represents the one covenant and the fruit of the vine represents the blood that ratify it? For those of you who might not be aware with this teaching, and without getting into too much detail about it, there are churches who teach that the fruit of the vine at the Lord's Supper must be taken from one cup that is shared by the whole congregation. And there's a couple different reasons why different people might believe that. Some people argue that it is a question of authority by example. And so they will say that Jesus only used one cup at the institution of the Lord's Supper, and so we only have the authority to use one cup today. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but personally, I'm not convinced that we can even say for sure that Jesus only used one cup at the institution of the Lord's Supper. But even if he did, there were other factors to Jesus' example that we would have to consider. Some people have concluded that because Jesus instituted it at the time that they were gathered together for a Passover meal, that the Lord's Supper must be taken as part of a meal. But that would contradict what Paul wrote about the purpose of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And so we have to use context, we have to use common sense, and we have to use a harmony of the different passages that we have about something to find out what examples are binding. And we'll talk about that in a moment. We know that the apostles taught and all the churches practiced the Lord's Supper as unleavened bread and fruit of the vine the first day of the week to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And we can infer from different passages that we have that the Lord's Supper was really the main reason why people gathered together on the first day of the week. Those are consistent and purposed examples. And that's not really what we see regarding the cup. And so for some people, it's all about an argument of examples. And for others, they basically add the cup as a third element to the Lord's Supper. And 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is a good place to see this. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 24, it says, "When he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'Take, eat. This is my body, which was broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes.'" And they will take this and they will say that the cup itself, the actual container, is what is being talked about. The cup is symbolic of the new covenant. That's the position as I understand it, basically defined. And so I'll give you a couple of ways to think about this and address this teaching. This is the argument that I remember hearing all growing up. It has to do with a figure of speech and the use of language. It's a little bit of a confusing argument in my opinion, and so I'll give it to you, I'll show you how it works into this context, and then I'll give you an argument that I think is easier. But the first one is, it has to do with this figure of speech that's called a metonymy. And that word was always confusing to me, but basically it just means that you use a different name for something, but the names have a relationship. And so an example would be, if I were to tell you, "I give you my heart," you would not take that to mean that I'm literally giving you my heart. You would take that to mean that I'm giving you my love. And so we're not reenacting a scene from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It's just a figure of speech. And that would be a metonymy, and it works the same way in this context. So when Jesus says this cup, he doesn't mean the cup itself. He means what's in the cup. Just like if I were to say, "I give you my heart," I don't mean my heart, I mean what's in my heart. And so let's look at how this plays out in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. In verse 25, Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." And so whatever he's talking about, whether it's the actual cup or it's the contents of that cup, that is the element that is in question. And then he says, "This do as often as you drink it." And so we have to figure out what it is in that sentence. And are we drinking the cup itself? Are we drinking the container? Or are we drinking what's in the container? And so that shows the figure of speech. That question shows the figure of speech. So we must be talking about the contents of the cup because you can't drink the cup itself. And then in verse 26, Paul now speaking, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup. And so again, are we drinking the cup itself or are we focusing on what's in the cup? That's how the monotony works, or monotony. It's kind of how I feel about this argument, but the metonymy, get that right. And so that's how the metonymy works. Anytime he says this cup, he's not talking about the container. He's talking about what's in the cup. Just like when I say, I give you my heart, I'm really talking about what's in my heart. And so another way to address this that I think is a lot simpler is just to read Luke's account of the institution of the Lord's Supper. And so if you look in Luke chapter 22, I think this makes it a lot easier. Luke chapter 22, and beginning in verse 17. It says, he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. To me, that should be the end of the conversation. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which was given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. And so we see that the cup, which again really must mean the contents of the cup, it was actually divided among the disciples in verse 17. And then verse 19, the bread was divided up. And in verse 20, it says, likewise, or in the same manner as he did the bread, he did the cup. And so you see a couple of different ways there where you see that the contents of the cup was actually divided up at the institution of the Lord's Supper. And so Jesus didn't even really use one cup as the way that we would understand it when he instituted the Lord's Supper. And then finally, just as a side comment that I think is worth mentioning, it's not very practical to think about these large congregations in the first century sharing one cup. You think about Jerusalem having 3,000 Christians added to the Lord's church in Acts chapter 2. That would have to be a really big cup. Even this congregation, if we were to use one cup, it would be very impractical, very difficult. And instead of fighting over the back pews, everybody would be fighting over the front pews. So nobody wants to drink after each other. And so it's not a very practical thing to happen. So because of the emphasis, I do want to mention this, because of the emphasis on the contents of the cup and not the cup itself, there's nothing wrong with using one cup. I know a lot of areas, heard a lot of stories about preachers in third world countries where a community can only find one cup. And so they have to use one cup. And so there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is to bind that and to add another element to the Lord's Supper. It's not a necessary thing to have one cup. And in most situations, I would say it's pretty impractical. So I hope that answers that question.